Military lawyers. Can a soldier just quit when war with Iran starts? Story 1. If you join the military, you're signed on for a specific amount of time and can't leave early unless they approve it. If you don't follow orders, you can face severe consequences, including prison time. Even if you only sign on for 4 years, under exceptional circumstances, the military can extend your time in the service. Sometimes, soldiers are only notified of this extension the day before they are scheduled to fly home. It's important to understand that your initial contract is typically for 8 years. After the initial active duty portion, if you don't re-enlist, you finish the remaining years in the inactive reserve. This means no regular duties or training, but in the event of a national draft, these individuals in the inactive reserve are among the very first to be called back to service. The recruiter may not emphasize this, but it is in the contract, and it's covered during the out-processing from active duty. One person noted that the recruiter was very clear about this before they signed, suggesting that the quality of information depends on the recruiter you get. Story 2. I remember when the USS Bonhomme Richard, a light carrier, caught fire in port. Shortly after, a few thousand naval reservists were ordered to work on ship construction due to COVID-related delays. Speculation arose that the fire might have been started by a frustrated reservist who had been called up. Instead, the person responsible was likely a reject from the SEAL training program. This individual couldn't leave the Navy, but wasn't a qualified sailor, so the only job he was eligible for was menial labor, like maintaining the deck of an aircraft carrier. Since around 2003, candidates for SEAL school have often been direct entrants who haven't served in the regular Navy first. Only a few dropouts from each class are offered alternative meaningful employment. Some guys I knew went through this. They thought they'd roll into BUDAS training like it was no big deal. When they didn't make it, they ended up getting orders to whatever ship had room for them. As undesignated seamen, it took them years to recover career-wise, and they left the service at the first opportunity because it was such a negative experience. Story 3. What about the oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States? That oath holds very little weight these days if people believe the government is acting outside the bounds of the Constitution. I did my part, by the way. I declined to re-enlist when we started gearing up for the conflict in Iraq, since anyone with half a brain could see that the official reasons given posed zero credible threat to the US. Story 4. There is a process for those who want to leave combat duty, submitting a conscientious objector form. Once submitted, you will no longer be in a combat role until your case is processed. However, you will likely be assigned to the worst jobs in the military, cleaning facilities, polishing equipment, and other menial tasks. The culture of the military will unfortunately have very little respect for you, but you will have the least amount of chance for being an active combatant. A word of warning: if you try to convince others to join you, you could be charged as the leader of a mutiny. The trick is to apply before you are urgently needed for a mission. It is an application, and the timing matters. For example, it's better to apply when you are in your home port if you are in the Navy, not while at sea or just before a deployment. If the military has to fly you out of a combat zone or off your ship outside of normal operations, you will most likely pay for it in some difficult way. Most commands will accept the application because, to them, you become a liability. Also, of note, you will most likely lose your security clearance instantly upon submission. Applying for conscientious objector status may result in a dishonorable or other than honorable discharge, and you may have to pay back signing bonuses. While the official policy might state one thing, there is a gray area, so you need to be prepared for various outcomes. Because of how this has been used in the past, applicants are often reassigned to non-combat roles and then may face prosecution. For other infractions, depending on the outcome, you might finish your enlistment in a support or admin role and then receive a less than honorable discharge, which can have consequences similar to a felony conviction on your civilian life. If you are a conscientious objector, it is best not to enlist in the first place. One of the biggest hurdles is that the individual needs to be opposed to all war in principle, not just opposed to a specific war. They will question you intensely about why you joined the military to begin with, or what you would do if your base was attacked. If someone has had a genuine change of heart and is now a pacifist, that's one thing. But if they simply don't like the president's decisions or current policy, that is not sufficient grounds for an objection. Story 5. Note that a dishonorable discharge is on par with having a felony conviction in civilian life, in most, if not all, states you lose your right to vote and your right to possess a firearm. You become ineligible for federal employment and likely any government employment down to the county level, and it shows up on any background check. This is not something you want following you around for the rest of your life. Story 6. It's 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and the only light in my office comes from the glow of my monitor and the faint, amber streetlights filtering through the blinds. The cleaning crew finished their rounds hours ago. The rest of the building is asleep. But I'm here, nursing a lukewarm coffee and staring at a new client file. It's a story I've seen a dozen times before, a fresh iteration of the same tragic, almost comical, misunderstanding of the world. A young man, barely old enough to vote, has decided to quit his job. His job just happens to be with the United States Army. Every time a case like this lands on my desk, I think of the Miller family. That case has become my personal benchmark for youthful naivety and parental panic. It's the story I tell myself when I need a reminder that no matter how airtight you think a contract is, someone will always believe they can just walk away from it with a handwritten note and a hopeful smile. It started, as these things often do, with a frantic phone call. A woman's voice, tight with a kind of privileged terror, was on the other end. "My son has been arrested," she said, as if he'd been caught shoplifting a video game. "They're saying it's military business. I think there's been a mistake. He quit last month. I scheduled a meeting for the next day." The Millers walked into my office, looking exactly as I'd pictured them. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a golf shirt and a look of profound, angry confusion, the kind of man who believes any problem can be solved by speaking to the manager. She was clutching a designer handbag like a life raft, her eyes red-rimmed and darting around my office as if she expected armed guards to burst through the door. They were from a world of quiet suburbs, good schools, and clear rules that had always bent in their favor. They were not prepared for the inflexible, ironclad world their son had stumbled into. "I don't understand," Mr. Miller began, his voice a low growl. "Kevin sent them his resignation 2 weeks ago." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the otherwise silent room. "A resignation?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Mrs. Miller fumbled in her handbag and produced a crumpled piece of paper. It was notebook paper, the kind with the little blue lines. On it, in a youthful, looping script, was a message written in pencil. I will never forget it. It read, "Dear Army, I am writing to inform you that I no longer wish to work at this job. My vibe is not a good fit for your corporate culture. Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Kevin Miller." I read it once, then read it again to fully appreciate its splendor. He had quit the Army like he was quitting a summer job at a smoothie stand. He even mentioned corporate culture. I looked up at his parents, who were watching me with expectant hope. This was the moment where my job shifted from legal counsel to a combination of elementary school teacher and grief counselor. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," I began slowly, "I need you to understand this very clearly. Your son did not have a job. He swore an oath and signed a legally binding federal contract of enlistment. When he left his duty station without permission, he didn't resign. In the eyes of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, he committed a felony, absent without leave, or, as they'll likely charge him, desertion." The word felony hung in the air. Mrs. Miller made a small, wounded sound. Mr. Miller's face hardened. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that your son isn't an ex-employee. He's a wanted fugitive, and they found him. May I ask how?" This was the part of the story that elevated it from a simple case of youthful stupidity into a legend. Mrs. Miller explained, through fresh tears, that Kevin had been feeling cooped up in the basement and decided to get some real-world experience. He'd started applying for jobs, a part-time position at a local Best Buy. On the application, I prompted, already sensing the impending comedic tragedy. "He needed a reference," she whispered. "From his last job." I just nodded, letting her get there on her own. "He listed his sergeant." I managed to hold back a sigh. It would have been unprofessional. This kid wasn't just a WOL. He was a walking, talking, self-incriminating black hole of common sense. He was being hunted by a multi-billion-dollar organization with global reach, and he provided them with his location via a job application. It was perfect. The military police didn't need to launch a nationwide manhunt. All they needed was for a hiring manager in suburban Ohio to make a phone call. I could just picture the scene. Some overworked Best Buy manager, checking references, getting a gravelly voiced Sergeant First Class on the other end of the line. "Yes, I know Private Miller. Tell me, does your store's return policy cover a slightly used United States soldier? Because we would very much like to make an exchange." The rest of the story unfolded as you'd expect. Two MPs, large and imposing, walked into the Best Buy, past the rows of gleaming laptops and flat-screen TVs. They located Kevin in the Geek Squad area, where he was apparently in the middle of explaining the benefits of an extended warranty. To a bewildered elderly couple, there was no chase, no drama. Just a quiet, firm Private Miller. "You're coming with us." His short-lived career in retail was over. His long, complicated future with the military justice system was just beginning. My job, then, was damage control. I had to explain to the Millers that their son wasn't getting fired. He was facing a court-martial. The best-case scenario was an other than honorable discharge, a permanent black mark on his record that would follow him for life, stripping him of all veterans' benefits, the G-bill for college, VA home loans, and the right to own a firearm in many states. The worst-case scenario was a few years in the military prison at Fort Leavenworth. This is the reality of the contract. It's an absolute. I've seen guys try other methods, of course. The direct defiance approach is always a bold, if foolish, choice. I once read a case file about a soldier in Iraq who just flat-out refused to do his assigned duty. He didn't run. He just said no. The military, in its infinite and terrifying wisdom, didn't send him home. They gave him a new job, making gravel with a pickaxe day in and day out, a punishment of such magnificent, soul-crushing futility that it was designed to make prison seem like a vacation. He chose to defy them, so they chose to own his every waking second in the most miserable way possible. Then there's the performance art of the fake psychological breakdown. It's a high-risk, high-reward gambit. Get it right, and you might get a medical discharge. Get it wrong, and you add malingering to your list of charges. It requires a level of commitment and acting talent that most people simply don't possess. The system is designed to be inescapable. It's a labyrinth where every corridor leads back to the center. The contract is written to be unbreakable because the entire structure of national defense rests on the simple premise that when an order is given, it is followed. The moment that breaks down, the whole system collapses. That is why the consequences are so severe. It's not about punishing one individual. It's about maintaining the absolute integrity of the system itself. In the end, for Kevin Miller, we managed to broker a deal. No prison time, but the OTH discharge was permanent. His parents paid my hefty fees, and their son came home, but not as a hero. He came home as a cautionary tale, a young man who had to list federal fugitive on his resume. Between high school and briefly employed at Best Buy, he learned his lesson. But it's a lesson I wish more young people would understand before they sign their lives away, thinking it's just another job they can quit. Drive. Quitting the military is like trying to unsubscribe from a shark. You can't. You can click the unsubscribe button as many times as you want, but the shark is still going to be there, and it's very, very disappointed in your lack of commitment. Story 7. I'm sitting in my office, and the air smells of old paper and lukewarm coffee. On my desk is a thick file for a new client, a disabled veteran trying to get the VA to cover a surgery for a knee he busted years ago. The paperwork is a nightmare, a bureaucratic fortress designed to wear you down. The VA is arguing that his injury wasn't technically service-related, even though it happened while he was on active duty. They are treating his knee like a disputed piece of equipment, a faulty part they're not sure is covered under warranty. And as I read through their sterile, passionless arguments, I can't help but laugh a dry, bitter laugh. Of course they see it that way. They're just following the core principle of the contract he signed 20 years ago. His knee never really belonged to him in the first place. Civilians have a hard time with this concept. It's alien to a world of workers' rights and personal autonomy. They think being a soldier is a job. But as a lawyer who has spent years navigating the labyrinth of military law, I can tell you, it is the most profound and misunderstood transaction a person can make. You don't sign on for a salary. You sign over the deed to your own body. You become, in the bluntest legal and practical terms, government property. I remember my own father, a grizzled veteran of a forgotten war, trying to explain this to me. When I told him I was thinking of joining the Air Force, he didn't give me a lecture on patriotism or honor. He sat me down at the kitchen table, his hands scarred and steady, and said, "Son, they will own you. Not your time, not your labor, your body. They can inject it with whatever they want, send it wherever they want, and if it gets broken, they'll decide if it's worth fixing. You are a tool, a piece of equipment. Less valuable than a rifle, because a rifle doesn't have parents to notify." At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Then, a few years later, I was a young JAG officer, and I saw what he meant in the most vivid, unforgettable way. It was at Parris Island, the infamous Marine Corps recruit depot, where they turn boys into weapons. I was there observing training. There was a young recruit, barely 18, a kid from somewhere up north with skin so pale it was almost translucent. After a full day of drills under the brutal South Carolina sun, he was cooked. His neck and arms were a blistering, angry red. He was in agony, but trying desperately not to show it, because showing pain in that environment is like bleeding in. A Shark Tank. His drill instructor, a gunnery sergeant who seemed to be powered by pure, distilled rage, noticed. He stopped his inspection and stalked over to the recruit. We all tensed, expecting a tirade about weakness, about hydration, about stupidity, but the gunny's attack came from a completely different, more terrifying angle. He got nose to nose with the kid, his voice a low hiss that cut through the humidity. "What is this, recruit?" he snarled, poking a sausage-like finger into the kid's sunburned neck. The recruit flinched. "This," the gunny continued, his voice dripping with venom, "is destruction of United States government property." The words fell like stones into the sudden silence. The other recruits stared, their expressions a mixture of fear and utter confusion. "You think this skin belongs to you? It doesn't. You signed it over. Your flesh, your bones, your blood, it's all property of the Marine Corps now. You have been issued a body, and your job is to maintain it in working order. You have failed. You have damaged government equipment." I watched the realization dawn on that kid's face. The shame of the reprimand was secondary to the profound existential shock. He wasn't a person who had made a mistake. He was a thing that had been damaged. That single moment taught me more about the nature of military service than any law book ever could. It's a concept so foreign to civilian life that trying to explain it often feels impossible. I once tried to explain it to my brother-in-law, a successful software engineer, during a family barbecue. He was talking about corporate wellness programs and employee rights. I told him the sunburn story. He just shook his head. "That's insane," he said. "That's got to be illegal. You could sue for that." I just smiled. "Sue who, Your Honor? On what grounds?" "The UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is its own legal universe. The rights you think of as fundamental simply don't exist in the same way. The military can order you to live in conditions, eat food, and take risks that would have any civilian CEO in prison." He didn't get it. He couldn't. His entire life was built on the foundation that he was the sole proprietor of his own body. He couldn't conceive of a world where that wasn't true. And this ownership isn't just a philosophical concept, it has brutally practical applications. The most stark example was the stop-loss policy during the wars in the 2000s. It was a perfect, terrible illustration of the contract's fine print. I was working on a case for a staff sergeant, a good man named Carlos Ramirez. He had done two tours in Afghanistan. He was a brilliant mechanic, the kind of NCO who held his unit together with grit and ingenuity. He had fulfilled his 6-year contract to the letter. His separation date was on the calendar. His wife had already moved their things to a new apartment near her family in Texas. He was done. He had paid his debt. A month before he was due to fly home, the order came down. His military occupational specialty, his job was deemed critical to the war effort. His entire unit was placed under the stop-loss policy. His contract was extended indefinitely. He wasn't asked, he was informed. He was a crucial piece of equipment, and the Army wasn't done using him yet. He sat in my office at Bagram Airfield, not with anger, but with a quiet, hollowed-out despair. "But I signed for 6 years," he kept repeating, his voice barely a whisper. "We had a deal." I had to explain to him that the deal he signed included a clause, buried deep in the fine print, that said in the event of war or national emergency, the terms could be changed. unilaterally. He had no recourse, no appeal. He was owned. He served another 18 months before they finally let him go. The light had gone out of his eyes. The contract had been fulfilled, but it had cost him something far more valuable than his time. It had cost him his belief in a fair deal. That's the essence of it all. From a painful sunburn treated as equipment damage, to a father's stark warning, to a man's life being extended with the stroke of a pen, it all stems from the same core principle. You sign the contract, you raise your hand, you swear the oath. And in that moment, the title deed to your own body is transferred. You become an instrument of national policy, a tool to be maintained, deployed, and, if necessary, sacrificed. And your only right, really, is to keep that piece of government property in the best working condition you can until the day they finally sign it back over to you. If you're lucky. TL, Doctor, joining the military is like leasing a car, except you're the car. You can't modify the paint job without permission, the mileage is unlimited and not up to you, and the leasing company can extend the lease indefinitely if they feel like it. Also, the car is sometimes on fire. Story 8. After my last little diatribe on what it means to become government property, a rational person might be asking themselves a very fair question. Why in God's name would anyone, ever, sign that contract? It's a logical conclusion. If the deal is so skewed, if the system is designed to own you so completely, why does the line at the recruiter's office never seem to get any shorter? Are they all just naive kids who haven't seen the fine print? Some of them are, sure, but not all. Over the years, I've learned that for every soldier who feels trapped by the military, there's another who was saved by it. For every person whose life was diminished by the contract, there's another whose life was forged by it. The truth is, you can't understand the appeal of the military's ironclad cage unless you understand the kinds of cages people are trying to escape from in the civilian world. The military contract is a deal with the devil, no question. But you'd be amazed how reasonable the devil's terms start to look when your life is already a special kind of hell. I don't meet these soldiers as clients, usually. The ones who make it through and come out the other side stronger don't often need a lawyer like me. I meet them in quieter, happier settings. I met one of the most memorable examples, not in a courtroom, but at a real estate closing. His name was Master Sergeant Frank Collier, and I was handling the legal paperwork for his first home purchase, facilitated by a VA loan. He was in his mid-40s, with a quiet confidence, a lovely wife, and to polite kids who were arguing over which bedroom would be theirs. He was the picture of middle-class stability. But the man he was 20 years prior was someone else entirely. I know, because while we waited for the sellers to arrive, he told me his story. Frank didn't join the military at 18 with a heart full of patriotic fire. He enlisted at 25 with a soul full of quiet desperation. The life he was running from was a cliché of rural poverty and neglect. He described a home with no fixed address, just a series of rundown rentals. His father was a ghost, a man who had left behind nothing but a name on a birth certificate. His mother was present in body, but absent in spirit, worn down by a life of hard-luck jobs and bad decisions. There was no structure, no discipline, no plan. Meals were a suggestion, not a guarantee. Healthcare was a fantasy. The future was a fog. He told me about the moment he decided to enlist. He was working a dead-end job at a tire factory, the air thick with the smell of vulcanized rubber and regret. He had just spent his entire paycheck to fix a tooth that had been aching for 6 months, and the dentist's bill had wiped him out. He was sitting in his beat-up car, eating a gas station sandwich for dinner, and he realized, with a clarity that terrified him, that this was it. This was his life. An endless cycle of physical labor, cheap food, and financial panic. He wasn't living. He was just managing a slow-motion decay. He wanted nothing more than to one day be a good husband and a good father, but the man he was at that moment had nothing to offer anyone. The next day, he walked into an army recruitment office. The sergeant behind the desk didn't sell him on honor or glory. He sold him on something far more tangible. He sold him on a life. "We will give you 3 hot meals a day," the recruiter said, ticking points off on his fingers. "A roof over your head that you don't pay rent for, free access, 2 doctors, dentists, and a gym. We will give you a steady paycheck every 2 weeks, on time. We will give you access to financial advisors who will teach you how to manage it. And if you serve honorably, We will give you the money to go to college and the backing to buy a house. To a kid from a stable, middle-class family, that might sound like a list of basic expectations. To Frank, who had none of those things, it sounded like the keys to the kingdom. He didn't even hesitate. The warnings about being government property, about the loss of freedom. They meant nothing to him. His freedom, as he saw it, was the freedom to be poor, hungry, and hopeless. He was more than willing to trade that in. He signed the contract. The first few months, he said, were a brutal shock. Basic training was designed to break you, to strip away your individuality and rebuild you as a component of a larger machine. But for Frank, there was an unexpected side effect. For the first time in his life, he had structure. His day was planned from 0500 to 2200. The rules were clear, and the consequences for breaking them were immediate and predictable. It was a harsh system, but in its own way, it was fair. It was a brutal meritocracy. If you did what you were told and you did it well, you were rewarded. If you failed, you were punished. Compared to the chaotic, arbitrary cruelty of the poverty he'd known, the Army's logic was a comfort. He started taking advantage of the promises. He enrolled in night classes using the Army's tuition assistance program. He slowly chipped away at an associate's degree in logistics. He went to the on-base financial advisor, a civilian contractor who patiently taught him how to create a budget, open a savings account, and build a credit score. He met his wife, a nurse working at the base hospital. He got married. They had their first child, and he described the profound, earth-shattering relief of taking his infant daughter to the doctor for a fever and not having to think for a single second about the cost. The system owned him, yes, but the system also provided for his family in a way he never could have on his own. It wasn't easy. He deployed twice. He saw things he doesn't talk about. He understands the nature of the contract on a visceral level. He knows that his body was an instrument of foreign policy, that his life was a calculated risk on a geopolitical chessboard. He saw good men get broken. He saw the stop-loss orders come down and watched friends who were supposed to go home get their lives extended by another year with the stroke of a pen. He felt the bars of the cage, but every time the weight of it felt like too much, he would look at what he was building. His stack of college degrees grew. He got his bachelor's, then started on his master's. He became a senior NCO, earning good money and the respect of his soldiers. His kids grew up in a stable home, never worrying where their next meal was coming from. He traveled the world, saw places he only ever seen in magazines. He was given a lifetime of experience, both good and bad, that shaped him into the man sitting across from me in my office. As we signed the final papers for his home loan, he looked around at my bookshelf, filled with heavy legal tomes. "You know, counselor," he said, "people on the outside, they see the price. They see the deployments, the discipline, the danger. They don't always see what you get back. As much as I had to give, I think I got back more. And that's the other side of the coin. That's the story that needs to be told alongside the tales of burnout and injustice. The military is a brutal, unforgiving tool. And if you take a person who is already whole, who comes from a life of stability and opportunity, that tool can sometimes break them. It can grind them down. But if you take a person who is already broken, who comes from a world of chaos and has nothing to lose, that same brutal, unforgiving tool can be the only thing in the world with the power to forge them into something new. Something strong. It's a high-stakes gamble. For many, it's a trap. But for some, for the Frank Colliers of the world, it is the only escape hatch they will ever find. The military contract is a deal with the devil. But if your life is already a special kind of hell, the devil's benefits package can start to look like salvation. Story 9. Every so often, a new client walks into my office. They're usually young, desperate, and they've spent way too much time on the more optimistic corners of the internet. They come in with a secret weapon, a magic word they think will solve all their problems and instantly terminate their military contract. They lean forward, their eyes wide with hope, and whisper it like it's a spell. Conscientious objection. Oh, it's a beautiful phrase. It sounds so noble, so righteous. It evokes images of principled stands and moral courage, and online. In forums filled with armchair activists, it's often touted as the ultimate loophole, the one weird trick the military doesn't want you to know about. They believe they can just declare their newfound pacifism and be handed an honorable discharge and a bus ticket home, and then they sit in my office, and I get the distinct pleasure of being the guy who has to explain that their magic bullet is actually a legal landmine, and they're about to tap dance through it in steel-toed boots. Proving you're a conscientious objector, CO, isn't a matter of filling out a form. It's a grueling, invasive, and deeply skeptical investigation into the very fabric of your soul, conducted by an organization that has a vested interest in believing you are a liar. The first thing I do is explain the legal standard, because that's where the fantasy immediately collides with a brick wall of reality. To qualify as ACO, you can't just be against the current war. You can't just be against a war you might be sent to. You must have a sincere, deeply held moral, ethical, or religious belief that is opposed to war in any form. All of it, from the Peloponnesian War to some hypothetical future conflict involving laser-toting space marines. Your opposition has to be total and absolute, and the burden of proof. It's entirely on you. You have to prove that your beliefs are not a matter of temporary convenience, but the core of your very being. The process itself is a bureaucratic nightmare designed to weed out the insincere. It starts with DD Form 1866, a document that asks you to essentially write a dissertation on your own soul. You have to explain the nature of your beliefs, how you acquired them, and how they affect your daily life. You need letters of support from people who can attest to your sincerity. Then come the interviews. You sit down with a military chaplain who interrogates your theology. You sit down with a military psychologist who interrogates your sanity. And finally, if you make it that far, you have a hearing in front of a board of commissioned officers, men and women who have dedicated their lives to the profession of arms, and you have to convince them that their entire existence is contrary to your deeply held moral code. It's like trying to convince the board of Coca-Cola that you are fundamentally opposed to fizzy drinks. I've seen it work. Once, in my entire career, I have seen one unicorn case, a perfect, unimpeachable claim that sailed through the system. His name was Private Daniels. He was a quiet, fiercely intelligent kid who had spent 2 years in a Jesuit seminary studying to be a priest before he enlisted. He'd left the seminary because his spiritual advisor told him he was too young and needed more life experience before taking his vows. So he did what a lot of lost, thoughtful kids do. He joined the army for a steady paycheck and a sense of purpose. When his unit got deployment orders for a combat zone, he filed his CO application. When he came to me for legal advice, he didn't bring a vague feeling. He brought a library. He had a 3-inch binder filled with evidence. There were letters from his priests and professors, going back 5 years, discussing his struggles with the concept of just war. There were essays he had written in college on the pacifist teachings of Thomas Merton, his mother-provided journal. Entries from his teenage years where he wrestled with questions of violence and faith. His hearing was a masterclass in sincerity. The board, a panel of 3 skeptical, battle-hardened officers, grilled him for 2 hours. They asked him about self-defense. They asked him hypothetical questions about defending his family. He answered every question with a calm, consistent, and deeply philosophical logic rooted in years of study and introspection. He wasn't performing, he was teaching. You could see the skepticism on the officers' faces slowly melt away, replaced by a grudging respect. They granted his application. He was honorably discharged 3 months later. He was the exception that proves the rule, a man whose conscience was so well documented it was undeniable for everyone. Daniels, however, there are 50 like a young specialist I'll call Kova. I didn't represent her, but I saw her case file later. Kova was 2 years into her enlistment as a communications specialist. By all accounts, she was a good soldier. She had qualified as an expert marksman at the rifle range. She had volunteered for extra duties. Then, her unit's name appeared on the deployment list for a rotation to a particularly nasty corner of the world. A week later, Specialist Kova discovered her conscience. Her application was a mess. For her proof, she had submitted a list of books she had recently checked out of the base library. Gandhi, MLK, a book of Buddhist teachings. Her personal statement was a rambling, emotional essay about the futility of conflict that sounded like it was cobbled together from fortune cookies. The letters of support were from her aunt and a high school friend, both saying they were surprised but supportive of her newfound pacifism. Her hearing was a disaster. The board of officers treated it not as a philosophical inquiry, but as a cross-examination. Specialist Kova, the lead officer, began. I see here on your record that 6 months ago, you received the Expert Rifleman badge. Tell me, at what point between firing a perfect score at 300 meters and today did your deeply held opposition to violence in all its forms manifest itself? She had no answer. They asked her if she would serve in a non-combat role, as a medic or a clerk. She said no, that any participation would violate her principles. They asked her why her principles never seemed to come up during the first 2 years of her service. Again, silence. They saw her claim for exactly what it was, a desperate, poorly planned attempt to dodge a difficult deployment. Her application was denied with extreme prejudice. But they didn't send her to the combat zone. That would be a risk to unit morale. Instead, they punished her with a special kind of bureaucratic torment. She was transferred to a records-keeping facility in the middle of nowhere. For the final 2 years of her contract, her job was to sit in a windowless room and digitally scan old, mildewed personnel files from the 1970s. She was a pariah, ostracized by her peers and ignored by her superiors. She was forced to serve out every last second of her contract in the most soul-crushing, mind-numbing way they could devise, and that's the risk you take. The system is designed to test your sincerity in the most cynical way possible. If you are faking it, they will find you out. And if they deny your claim and you still refuse to follow orders, then you are no longer a conscientious objector. You are just a criminal facing a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, and potential prison time. The path of conscience is not a loophole. It is a labyrinth, and for most who enter, the only way out leads to a place far worse than the one they were trying to escape. Dr. Using a conscientious objector claim to get out of the military is like telling the IRS you're morally opposed to taxes. Unless you have a documented, lifelong history of living in a cave and trading exclusively in berries, they're not going to buy it, and they're going to be very, very interested in auditing your entire life.